I'm just back from almost 2 weeks travelling with Fred Olsen Cruise Lines on the MS Borealis from Liverpool in northwest England to the north of Norway. Yes, a cruise well beyond the Arctic Circle in the darkness and sub-zero temperatures of January. All, of course, with the goal of seeing the aurora borealis or the Northern Lights. A winter cruise in Norway is very different from your typical cruise, and in this video I'm going to talk about some of the reasons why. Did the Northern Lights come out to play for us? Keep watching to find out as I count down the top 6 things to expect on a Fred Olsen Northern Lights cruise to Northern Norway. Let's get started with number 6. Passengers. A winter cruise attracts a different kind of guest. Fred Olsen is a Norwegian-owned cruise line, but it's one that serves the British market, and in particular a very mature segment of that market. So on a typical Fred Olsen cruise, you would expect an elderly crowd who favour a traditional approach to cruising with a British onboard experience. While much of that was still true on the Borealis, the average age definitely skewed a little younger than other Fred Olsen cruises, while still being mainly made up of retired people or those approaching retirement age. There was also a general curiosity among the passengers and a keenness for getting outside and exploring that you don't always see on cruises to places such as the Mediterranean or the Canary Islands. There were also a lot of keen photographers on board, hoping to catch the Northern Lights on film, but also hoping to photograph the landscapes and wildlife of Northern Norway in the very special winter light that we have here. My cruise was also a long way short of capacity. There were just under 800 people on board on a ship that could hold almost 1,400. This meant that finding a table in the buffet or in one of the bars for a pre-dinner drink was never a problem. The reason for the quiet cruise was most likely that the departure was just a couple of days into the year. Northern Lights cruises in September and October and in February and March are much more likely to be busier. Different cruise ports. On most cruise itineraries, the ports of call are the real highlight of the trip. That's not always the case in Norway. Cities like Bergen and Stavanger are always popular ports, but for fjord cruises, it's more about the sail-ins and sail-outs along the fjords themselves, while in the winter, it's about finding clear skies for the best chance of stargazing and a Northern Lights display. Of the 6 ports we stopped in, 3, Alta, Narvik and Molde, are relatively uncommon cruise ports. We were not stopping there for the ports themselves, but for attractions in the nearby region, and in the case of Alta, the hope of seeing the Northern Lights from the ship. So much so, we actually stayed docked in Alta for 36 hours, much longer than you would see on a typical cruise. Alta, Narvik and Molde are all small towns with relatively little to do for the independent traveller, and although there were some excursions on offer, including great outdoor experiences like dog sledding and snowshoeing, not everyone wanted to pay the relatively high prices of those excursions, and so many people did still stay in the small towns or even on the ship. There were some ports of call which were more interesting in themselves though. Tromsø in particular is always a highlight of the north, with a lot to see and do in the city itself. Although unfortunately on this occasion, rain and snow meant that many people had to cut short their planned walks around the city. That being said, I did speak to many people who had dressed up and they spent a long time in Tromsø enjoying the museums and galleries and shops. Bad weather is just something you have to run with when visiting Norway at any time of year, and especially of course in the middle of the winter. Our final port of call before the ship returned to Liverpool was my home city of Trondheim, where there is no shortage of things to see and do. Nevertheless, you just have to expect a different experience from ports of call during a winter cruise. Diverse things to do. 2 weeks is a long time to be on a cruise ship, and with only 6 ports of call, I had expected to be bored at least some of the time, but I was not. There was always something going on. I had expected a series of lectures and maybe a few quizzes, and yes, that was the case, but what I hadn't appreciated is how much more there would be on the programme. This was especially true if you were into arts and crafts or you wanted to learn a new skill. On sea days, classes took place in the dedicated studio space on all things arts and crafts, including watercolours based on the Arctic landscapes we had just sailed through. Down in the auditorium, there were regular cookery classes and even the opportunity to learn the ukulele. In the evenings, live music was offered in most lounges, and there was plenty of opportunity for dancing, no matter your experience. We were also joined by King Neptune as we sailed north into the Arctic Circle for a ceremony in which people who were heading north for the first time were invited to participate in. The icy ceremony was one of the most popular events on the ship outside the evening shows, and I don't remember another time on the whole journey when I saw so many of the guests all together. Fantastic food. Prior to sailing, I had been told to expect a very British experience in the restaurants on the Borealis. While that was true, there was a daily roast carvery on offer, and free afternoon tea was served every day, for example. There was a much wider range of food than I had expected. My breakfasts consisted of salmon and fresh fruit most days, while I made the most of the international staff in the kitchens on board to enjoy freshly made stir-fries and Thai curries and Indian curries and other global dishes most days. I did sample the more traditional British food on offer, and I can recommend both the roast beef and the scones. I did eat in the buffet restaurant for most of my meals. I just simply prefer a more informal dining experience when I'm travelling. But I was able to try the main restaurant and the two specialty restaurants on board. The two specialty restaurants do come at an additional charge, but this is reasonable when compared to many other cruise lines. The food in both was outstanding. Colours and Tastes offers an Asian fusion concept. The curried lamb shank that I was served was both massive and absolutely delicious. Vasco is a Goan restaurant which provides an intriguing introduction to the cuisine from the Goa region of India through this platter of starters and the deep, rich flavours in all the dishes and all the accompaniments. For me, the coconut dessert was the real highlight. The Northern Lights. So it's time to answer that question you've probably been wondering about since the beginning of the video. Did we see the Northern Lights on a Northern Lights cruise? The answer is yes, but it took a lot of patience. Those of us keen aurora hunters had sat through 3 cloudy nights in the far north, waiting for a break in the clouds and only getting small glimpses of the lights. Some people out on excursions had more luck, especially this snowshoeing group in Alta. But sailing away just 1 hour out of Tromsø, the sky began to clear, and it began to clear very fast, giving us an outstanding view of the night sky, one of the best I've ever seen, with Mars and the Seven Sisters clearly visible overhead. And then it happened. The aurora show started with this fantastic shape appearing just off the starboard side on the front of the ship. It was a much more intense green than we'd seen so far. Within an hour, the lights were overhead and in all directions. We just watched in amazement as one of the best aurora displays I've seen in almost 12 years of living in Norway presented itself overhead. Green and purple light were clearly visible several times, including when the whole aurora rotated above our heads and during this explosion of needles. The atmosphere on deck was electric, and I was just hoping that everyone who had wanted to see the lights was watching at this very moment. There was more to see over the days to come, including 2 nights later when we were sailing east along the Lofoten Wall towards Narvik, and the lights once again came out to play on the front of the ship. Your chances of a sighting on a Northern Lights cruise absolutely are high, but there is no guarantee of seeing the Northern Lights, especially no guarantee of seeing a really great show like we had. That's just how this goes. That brings me on to the most important thing to know before you book a Northern Lights cruise to Northern Norway. You must be flexible. The most important thing to bear in mind when considering a winter cruise to Northern Norway is flexibility. That's not a word typically associated with cruising. On a typical summer cruise, many people simply enjoy everything being taken care of for them. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that type of cruise. But to get the most out of an aurora chasing cruise in the winter, you have to approach it with a flexible, proactive mindset. There are a few elements to this. Firstly, the highlight of this cruise, and for many the whole reason to come, is the opportunity to see the Northern Lights. But no one knows when an aurora display might start, or just as importantly, how long it might last when it does start to make an appearance. You might see a faint streak on the horizon that looks just like a cloud, but that disappears 30 seconds later. Or that faint streak might return, begin to build, and within half an hour have become an explosion of colour and movement that stays above your head for hours. Nobody knows. For me, that's all part of the fun. But for many people, it came as a big surprise and a big frustration as the days went on. Why is that? Well, the prime time for an aurora show tends to be between about 7 p.m. and midnight. On a cruise ship, this is also prime time for eating dinner, enjoying drinks, and enjoying the evening entertainments. Now, you absolutely shouldn't miss any of that by standing out on deck all night, every night. But just be aware that by staying inside on the ship and only waiting for announcements, you may miss something very special. On several occasions, there were announcements made from the bridge about a Northern Lights appearance, while people were all dressed up for the evening. In some cases, the dining rooms emptied upon these announcements. Now, many of those people rushed out on deck without any kind of winter clothing, took one look at what initially appeared to be a faint streak in the sky, and then went back inside, not realising that within half an hour, that faint streak would become something very special indeed. Other people chose to go and get their winter clothing on, and then spent half an hour just to see what would happen out on deck before they returned to their evening. That's the flexible, proactive attitude to have if you want the best chance of seeing the lights while still enjoying the evening entertainment on a cruise. You should also be prepared for bad weather and high waves that could potentially change the itinerary. Now, while this did not happen to us, ports can frequently be missed on winter cruises. So once again, you just have to be prepared to be flexible to get the most out of a journey like this. If you go into this with a flexible, proactive mindset, you're going to have a great time on a winter cruise to Northern Norway. I'm going to be making more videos about this Northern Lights cruise, including a full ship tour of Fred Olsen's MS Borealis, so there will be plenty more to see on the channel soon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.